You know, this Christmas Eve will mark, according to some research I looked up, it's going to mark 17 years since Mobius 25 years later was originally created and debuted. And the reason I say that is because, 17 years ago, original head writer, or one of the original head writers, Ken Penders, had penned Mobius 25 years later to be the in canon and in continuity future of Sonic and the Freedom Fighters. Now, for a lot of us, when we first read this story, we were actually kind of cool with it. I enjoyed it personally and thought it was nice to see the characters out of that traditional environment that we've always seen them in and in something new, even if it took place like 25 years later in the future as far as the continuity was concerned. So it's kind of cool to see that. And I also like the fact that we were left on a cliffhanger, knowing that eventually and inevitably Ken Penders may probably follow up on it. Unfortunately, Ken left the book before a follow up could be done, but then Ian Flynn, during his early run with the book, came in and decided to finish and conclude that cliffhanger as far as Mobius 25 years later is concerned. However, Ian Flynn, in doing so, also wanted to make it clear from his point of view and from other sources' point of view that Mobius 25 years later is not the actual future. It's not in continuity, but instead it's an alternate timeline. It's a what if dimension. Now, of course, Ken Penders wasn't too thrilled with this, but I guess he was willing to let it go as long as they potentially would acknowledge Mobius years later as being the future. This is one of the reasons, actually, why the characters of Julie Sue and Jeffrey St. John and any of the characters that Ken had created during his run with the book were written out. Not just due to, behind the scenes issues like with payments and royalties and all that, but part of the agreement was that, Ian Flynn and Archie Comics and Sega could utilize them, but as long as especially if they were doing the future storylines, but as long as the future of Mobius years later was looked at as being canon. And Ian Flynn, along with those at Archie and maybe even Sega, said, no, we're not going to do that because we're not going to spoil something that potentially may or may not happen. So, long story short, you could say that's part of the reasons you said goodbye to the characters like Julie Sue. Not just because of royalties and stuff like that were not being paid to Ken for the use of his characters, but mainly one of the reasons being because of the fact that Archie Comics and Sega and even Ian, to an extent, if not mostly an extent, would not acknowledge or want to acknowledge Mobius years later as being canon, as being the in-continuity future. Instead, they were going to utilize it as an alternate universe and an alternate timeline, a what-if dimension. And, when you look at it from both perspectives, fans were cool with it either way. Yeah, it was a little confusing because, you have one writer who came up with it originally saying it is canon and it is in continuity, but then you have the newer writer and the same people that, Ken worked for at one point, coming out and saying, no, it's not. Instead, it's an alternate timeline. It's an alternate universe. It's a what-if dimension. And, it basically did cause confusion because fans were like, well, wait a minute. We were pretty much trained and set, in motion by Ken Penders to accept that Mobius years later is the future. So there was a lot of fans, including myself in a way, that was like, yeah, Ian, you could say it's not the future, it's alternate, but there's a lot of us that believe it is. That even if it got reset and things changed and all that in some capacity, we still look at it as being the future, whether you want to admit it or not. Now, again, one could understand why Ian Flynn and even Archie Comics and them would say, no, it's not the future, due to the fact that Ian Flynn is someone that doesn't like spoilers. Now, this, of course, is coming from somebody that, coincidentally, if not ironically at times, during his run with the Archie book of Sonic and the current IDW book of Sonic, has had a situation where one book will spoil the ending of another or vice versa. So for him to come out and say he doesn't like spoilers, some may say it's hypocritical, but in a way it is kind of understanding. He doesn't, basically he wants people to be surprised as to what's to come next. And that the same goes with Archie Comics, and I'm sure Sega to some extent. So to basically come out and say, yeah, this future is the future, it's in canon, would be spoiling the outcome. So, you can understand it from his perspective, from his point of view as to why he changed it up, along with the suggestion and greenlit of Archie and Sega. But Ken pretty much trained us as fans back when he was writing the book to accept anything to be canon, even if it took place in the future. So the question obviously is, who's telling the truth? Who do you believe? Looking back on it 17 years after its conception, do you run with Ken Penders' idea and say, yes, it is the future? Or do you run with Ian Flynn's and say, no, it's an alternate dimension, it's an alternate timeline? It's a what-if scenario. Who do you believe? For me, I like the concept, and I'm willing to accept the fact that I think it is the future. And I think the reason Ken Penders came up with that idea was because even back when he was working on the book, he wasn't too sure how much longer the book would last. Because originally, he thought issue 50 would be it, right? He originally thought that, but sales started to come up and started to rise up, and it's like, hey, we can continue this. So they continued it, as well as at the behest of Sega, he ended up reviving Sally from a potential death. So even after doing all that, he was still kind of wondering how much longer it was going to last, because even though comic sales were high for it, I'm sure he was realizing that it wouldn't be much longer until maybe Archie and Sega would pull the plug. So perhaps that's why he wanted to make Mobius Years Later canon, so that at least as fans, we could have the satisfaction of knowing, hey, the characters somewhat got a happy ending. And I'm sure he was going to follow through on it had he remained on the book. Now, as far as Ian Flynn is concerned, again, like I said, he's a guy that ironically doesn't like spoilers, probably the same way with Archie and Sega, but also, so by acknowledging he doesn't like spoilers, I should say, he basically decided, as I mentioned, that it's not going to be canon, and instead it's going to be an alternate universe and timeline. And I'm assuming that he did that because he felt the comic was going to continue for a very long time. That is, of course, until Sega decided to, end their partnership with Archie Comics and now pretty much move the book over to IDW and basically restart it from scratch. But yeah, I think that's why Ian Flynn didn't want to acknowledge, Mobius Years Later as being the actual future, because he probably felt the comic was going to go on for a long, long time, not realizing that, hey, there's a potential it could end, and which it did. So the question obviously is, who was in the right? Was it Ken Penders by saying that it is canon and in continuity? Or was it Ian Flynn by saying, no, it's an alternate universe and timeline and a what if? And do you think, and the other question is, did Ian Flynn jump the gun and not realize, hey, maybe I should put it in my back pocket or put it in the back of my mind that this is the future, because I don't know what the future holds for the book? I look at it this way, and I say this with all due respect, and no offense whatsoever to Ian Flynn. I think he should have basically considered it as the future. Yes, he could have still had the belief that it's an alternate dimension and everything, but I think he should have kept it in the back of his mind that this is the future in canon and in continuity, because you never know what, because speaking of the future, you don't know what the future was going to hold as far as the book, under Archie Comics was concerned. But what do you guys think? What are your thoughts on Mobius Years Later, 25 years later, 30 years later, depending on how you look at it? How did you feel about it when you first read it? Who do you think was in the right and in the wrong as far as whether or not it was in canon, whether or not the future storyline was an in-canon continuity future, an actual future, or what if? What were your thoughts when you first read it? Comment down below. Let me know what you all think about it, and I will talk to y'all later.